It began not with a bang, but with silence, a silence that rolled across 11 time zones. From the frozen Arctic ports of Murmansk to the sun-bleached deserts of Central Asia. In the final week of December 1991, the red flag with its hammer and sickle was lowered from the Kremlin's roof for the last time. Those who witnessed it said the moment felt impossible, as though the sky itself had dimmed. For nearly 70 years the Soviet Union had stood as a colossus, an empire, forged in revolution, tempered by war, and defined by its defiance of the West. It was the nation that had beaten back the Nazi war machine, launched the first human into space, and promised to build a utopia on Earth. Yet, in that quiet Moscow night, the great Soviet experiment ended, not in conquest or invasion, but in exhaustion. This is the story of how one of the most powerful empires in history collapsed almost overnight. A story of ideology, an ambition, of fear and hope, of people caught between the weight of history and the pull of the future. To understand why the Soviet Union fell, we must go back to the beginning. To a time when its birth seemed to herald a new dawn for humanity. The year was 1917. Russia was bleeding. The Great War had ravaged its armies, hunger gripped its cities, and the old order of the Tsars teetered on the brink. Out of this chaos emerged the Bolsheviks, revolutionaries led by Vladimir Lenin, who promised peace, bread, and land. When they seized power, they claimed they were not merely changing a government, but reshaping history itself. The Soviet Union, born officially in 1922, would not be just another state. It would be a civilization built on ideology. A world where workers ruled, where the inequalities of capitalism were erased, and where the future belonged to the collective. For decades, that vision drove its people to extraordinary feats. They turned peasant villages into industrial giants, electrified a continent, and, through sheer force of will, transformed a backward empire into a superpower. Yet the same fire that powered their dream also consumed it. Under Joseph Stalin, the Soviet Union became an empire of paradoxes, both visionary and brutal, modern and medieval. Stalin's rule was built on fear, purges that wiped out millions, gulags that swallowed entire generations, and propaganda that painted terror as triumph. But he also forged the steel backbone of the nation, mobilizing industry and discipline on a scale the world had never seen. When Hitler's armies invaded in 1941, the Soviet people fought not just for survival, but for redemption. The Great Patriotic War, as they called it, became the crucible of their identity. From the ruins of Stalingrad to the ashes of Berlin, the Soviet Union emerged victorious. Scarred yet triumphant, standing tall as one of two global superpowers. For the next 4 decades, it would stare down the United States in a struggle not just for power, but for the soul of the modern world. But beneath the surface of triumph lay decay. The Soviet model, forged in wartime discipline, began to buckle under the weight of peace. Central planning, the beating heart of its economy, that once mobilized steel, coal, and oil for war, could not adapt to the unpredictable rhythms of modern life. Bureaucracy replaced innovation, targets replaced truth. Factories produced to meet quotas, not demand. Official statistics became fiction, written to satisfy ministers, not markets. Yet the illusion of progress persisted, propped up by propaganda and fear. The Soviet citizen was told he lived in the most advanced society on Earth, even as he queued for hours for bread, soap, or shoes. By the 1970s, the Soviet Union had reached its zenith, and its breaking point. The leadership of Leonid Brezhnev brought stability but also stagnation. The generation that had built the revolution was dying off, replaced by cautious men in gray suits who ruled by routine rather than vision. Oil exports kept the system afloat, masking deeper problems. In foreign policy, the USSR projected confidence, sending troops into Afghanistan, arming allies in Africa and Asia, challenging the United States in every theater. But at home, cracks were widening. Censorship, corruption, and cynicism corroded faith in the system. Ordinary citizens learned to live with the lie, to say one thing, believe another, and trust nothing. Then came Mikhail Gorbachev. When he rose to power in 1985, he was seen as a reformer, a man of the new generation. Charismatic, intelligent, and idealistic, he genuinely believed the Soviet system could be saved, not by abandoning socialism, but by purifying it. His twin policies of glasnost openness and perestroika restructuring were meant to breathe new life into the decaying empire. For the first time in Soviet history, citizens were allowed to speak, to criticize, even to dream publicly. Newspapers exposed corruption, historians revisited forbidden truths, and millions felt the first taste of freedom. But with freedom came chaos. Gorbachev believed transparency would strengthen the system. Instead, it revealed how deeply it had rotted. As archives opened, citizens discovered the full horror of Stalin's purges. The scale of the gulags, the lies about production and prosperity. Trust evaporated. Meanwhile, perestroika unleashed forces Gorbachev could not control. By loosening the grip of the party on the economy, he inadvertently unleashed economic collapse. Prices soared, factories shut down, and shortages worsened. The people who had once looked to the state for stability now found only uncertainty. Across the vast expanse of the Soviet Union, from the Baltic republics to the Caucasus Mountains, nationalist movements began to stir. For decades, the empire had been held together by fear. Now that fear was dissolving. In the late 1980s, television became the mirror of the revolution. Images of protests in Lithuania, strikes in Poland, and demonstrations in Moscow spread like wildfire. For the first time, Soviet citizens saw themselves not as silent subjects, but as a people in motion. The old slogans no longer inspired. The empire's myths were crumbling in real time. And outside, the world was changing just as fast. In 1989, the Berlin Wall, that concrete symbol of division between East and West, fell. The satellite states of Eastern Europe, once bound to Moscow by tanks and treaties, slipped away one by one. Gorbachev refused to send the Red Army to stop them, believing violence would destroy the moral foundation of his reforms. But in sparing Europe, he doomed his empire. By 1990, the Soviet Union was unraveling. Inflation raged, stores were empty, and republics declared sovereignty in open defiance of Moscow. Boris Yeltsin, the populist leader of the Russian Republic, emerged as Gorbachev's rival, a man who spoke directly to the people's anger. He promised democracy, prosperity, and independence from the old party elite. As Yeltsin rose, the Communist Party's authority collapsed. On August 19, 1991, hardline members of the government launched a coup. Tanks rolled into Moscow, radio stations blared martial music, and Gorbachev was detained in his Crimean dacha. For a moment, it seemed the empire might return to its old ways. But the people of Moscow flooded the streets. Defying curfew, they surrounded the tanks, climbed them, and faced the soldiers with nothing but their voices. Atop one of those tanks stood Boris Yeltsin, white-shirted, defiant, calling for resistance. The world watched live as the coup unraveled. 3 days later, the plotters surrendered. The Communist Party, once the unshakable core of Soviet power, was banned. When Gorbachev returned to Moscow, he found himself leader of a nation that no longer existed. The union he had tried to save was dissolving before his eyes. In December 1991, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met secretly in a forest lodge in Belarus and signed the Belavasia Accords, declaring the Soviet Union defunct. Gorbachev, isolated in the Kremlin, held on for a few final weeks. On December 25, he resigned. That evening, the red flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. The Soviet Union was no more. In the aftermath of that December night, a strange quiet settled over the land that had once been the beating heart of an empire. Moscow's streets were filled with the cold hum of uncertainty. Soldiers who had sworn oaths to defend the Union stood idle, their uniforms now representing a country that no longer existed. For ordinary citizens, there was no sense of triumph, only confusion. One day they had been Soviet, the next, they were something else. Russian, Ukrainian, Latvian, Estonian, new identities grafted onto old lives. The world's largest state had vanished almost overnight, leaving behind 15 independent republics and millions of people adrift in history. The fall of the Soviet Union seemed sudden, but its roots stretched deep, tangled in decades of contradiction. To understand how it all came apart, we must look at the forces that eroded the empire from within long before the flag came down. The Soviet Union was built on an idea, the belief that human society could be engineered. Its founders had promised to replace chaos with order, greed with equality, and faith with science. The party claimed to speak for the people, but it ruled them through control. At its height, the Soviet state directed every aspect of life. What could be printed, where one could live, even what could be thought. The same system that could launch satellites and build cities could also starve millions and silence truth. And it was this very control that sowed the seeds of collapse. A society that cannot question itself cannot correct itself. Problems festered unseen, buried under layers of bureaucracy and fear. Economically, the Soviet Union was a miracle of mobilization and a disaster of efficiency. It could build tanks faster than any other nation, but it could not make enough shoes. Central planning worked in war, when the goal was singular, victory at any cost. But in peace, the system faltered. Managers falsified reports to meet production targets, resources were wasted on projects no one wanted. The result was an economy that appeared powerful on paper but was hollow inside. By the late 1970s, as the West entered a new technological age, the USSR remained chained to heavy industry, while Americans and Europeans began to live in a world of microchips and personal computers. The Soviet citizen still queued for bread and wore the same gray coat as his father. The gap was not just in wealth, it was in imagination. The military might of the Soviet Union masked its weakness. The Red Army's strength was both its pride and its burden. Nearly half of the nation's budget went into maintaining the illusion of invincibility. But power built on fear cannot last forever. The Afghan War, launched in 1979, became the Soviet Union's Vietnam, a decade-long quagmire that drained its treasury, its morale, and its belief in its own mission. Young soldiers sent to Afghanistan returned broken, disillusioned, carrying stories of a war that made no sense. For the first time, mothers of fallen soldiers openly questioned the state. The war that was meant to project strength instead exposed the empire's fragility. Ideologically too, the Soviet dream was unraveling. Marxism-Leninism had promised to create a new man, selfless, enlightened, devoted to the collective. But after decades of shortages, corruption, and propaganda, cynicism replaced faith. People went through the motions, attending parades, voting in one candidate, elections, reciting the slogans, but inside, they no longer believed. The Soviet citizen had learned to live in two worlds, the official one, where everything was perfect, and the private one, where reality was endured quietly. The distance between those two worlds grew unbearable. When Gorbachev's glasnost finally tore down the wall of silence, it released not just truth but rage, decades of humiliation and betrayal bursting into the open. The collapse of the Soviet Union was not a single event, it was a chain reaction. Once one republic broke away, the rest followed. Nationalism, suppressed for generations, reawakened. In the Baltics, people formed human chains stretching hundreds of miles demanding freedom. In Georgia and Armenia, ancient ethnic tensions flared. Ukraine, the breadbasket of the Union, declared its independence, taking with it much of the USSR's agricultural and industrial might. The empire that had once ruled through unity now dissolved through diversity. Each nation rediscovered its own story, and in doing so, broke the spine of the Soviet myth that all peoples could be one under socialism. Meanwhile, on the world stage, the Soviet Union was losing its other war, the Cold War of technology and image. The United States under Ronald Reagan had embraced an arms buildup that the Soviet economy could not match. The Strategic Defense Initiative, though largely theoretical, convinced Soviet leaders that the West was leaping ahead. The space race, once a source of pride, became a reminder of decline. When Yuri Gagarin went to space in 1961, the Soviet Union seemed invincible. By the 1980s, it was struggling to keep its satellites functioning. Western television, music, and fashion seeped through the Iron Curtain, showing Soviet citizens a world of color and abundance they could only dream of. Even forbidden jeans or bootleg rock records became acts of quiet rebellion, symbols of an empire's fading hold over hearts and minds. By the time Gorbachev tried to reform the system, it was already too late. His perestroika aimed to fix the economy by mixing socialism with elements of market logic. But instead, it destroyed the delicate balance that had kept the system functioning. State enterprises, now partially liberated, stopped obeying central commands. The flow of goods collapsed. Inflation, once a Western concept, became a Soviet reality. The ruble plummeted, wages lost meaning. Ordinary families who had once felt secure were plunged into uncertainty. As shortages deepened, people began to barter, to trade, to survive on instinct. For a society built on the promise of order, this chaos was existential. At the same time, Gorbachev's foreign policy, his dream of ending the Cold War, had unintended consequences. He sought peace with the West, but at home it was seen as surrender. The withdrawal from Afghanistan, the fall of Eastern Europe, the disarmament treaties, these gestures of goodwill convinced many that the Soviet Union was retreating from greatness. The old guard in the military and the KGB saw betrayal. Hardliners whispered that Gorbachev was dismantling the empire with his own hands. And in a way he was, though not from malice, but from belief. He thought he could build a humane socialism, one that would coexist with democracy. But in loosening control, he unleashed the very forces that socialism had kept at bay, nationalism, ambition, and greed. The Soviet collapse was not only a political event but a psychological one. For 70 years, Soviet citizens had been told they were part of something eternal, something destined to outlive capitalism itself. When that illusion shattered, it left a void no one knew how to fill. In Moscow, the older generation wept as statues of Lenin were pulled down, the young celebrated but uncertainly. Across the former republics, borders were redrawn, currencies replaced, and armies divided. Families found themselves separated by new frontiers overnight. Scientists who had built rockets now sold trinkets in open-air markets. Teachers went months without pay. The empire had vanished. But its shadow remained. In memories, in ruins, in the quiet ache of those who had believed in a dream that turned to dust. And yet, amid the wreckage there was a strange sense of possibility. For the first time in a century, Russia and its neighbors faced a blank page. The question was, whether they could write a new story, free from the weight of ideology, or whether the ghosts of the Soviet past would continue to haunt them. History would soon give its answer. When the dust settled, the Soviet Union was gone, and in its place stood a fractured world of uncertainty. Overnight, 290 million people had become citizens of 15 new nations, each struggling to define itself in the ruins of the old order. The empire that once spanned a sixth of the earth had disintegrated not through conquest, but through confusion. Moscow, the once imperial center, found itself at the heart of a diminished Russia, a nation humiliated, exhausted, and uncertain of its future. The 1990s were a decade of chaos, a time when history seemed to lose its direction. In those years, the people who had grown up under the red flag faced a reality they could scarcely recognize. The dream that had promised equality gave way to a world of ruthless capitalism, corruption, and survival. What had once been a superpower became a question mark. In the first months after the collapse, the old institutions still lingered like ghosts. Bureaucrats who had spent their lives obeying orders now waited for orders that would never come. The economy, built entirely on state planning, suddenly found itself exposed to the free market. But there were no rules, no safeguards, no compass. Factories closed by the thousands. Pensions evaporated. The ruble collapsed. Inflation soared so high that salaries lost value between morning and evening. Entire professions disappeared overnight. Engineers, teachers, and doctors, once the pride of the Soviet middle class, were reduced to selling cigarettes, used clothes, or anything they could find in the open-air markets that sprang up across the cities. For many, it felt as though civilization itself was unraveling. And yet, amid the hardship, there was also a strange exhilaration, a sense that anything was possible. The rigid walls of ideology had crumbled, and with them, fear. People could speak freely, travel abroad, start businesses, publish forbidden books. In Moscow, a generation that had never known freedom suddenly found itself in a dizzying new world. Western goods flooded in: Coca-Cola, Levi's jeans, fast food, symbols of a consumer paradise that had been denied for decades. Nightclubs, advertisements, and neon signs transformed the once drab cities into chaotic playgrounds of capitalism. But behind the bright lights lurked an underworld of crime and corruption. The old communist elite, armed with insider knowledge and connections, seized control of state assets, buying entire industries for pennies. A new class of oligarchs was born, men who went from obscurity to unimaginable wealth almost overnight. They owned oil fields, television stations, and even political parties. For ordinary Russians, democracy came to mean chaos, and freedom came to mean inequality. The geopolitical aftershocks were immense. The Soviet collapse left a power vacuum across Eurasia. The vast nuclear arsenal that had once terrified the world was suddenly scattered across 4 new states: Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. The question of who controlled those weapons haunted Western leaders. For the first time since 1945, the world's balance of power was uncertain. The United States emerged as the sole superpower, declaring the end of the Cold War and the dawn of a new world order. But the triumph was uneasy. Across the former Soviet space, wars flared in the Caucasus, in Moldova, in Tajikistan, brutal reminders that the empire's fall had left deep wounds. Ethnic conflicts, frozen for decades by Moscow's iron grip, now reignited with ferocity. In Chechnya, the Russian Federation fought to keep its own territory from breaking away, plunging into a war that would scar the nation for years. For the people who had once believed in the Soviet dream, the psychological toll was immense. The collapse was not just political, it was spiritual. Generations who had been taught to see themselves as builders of history now felt abandoned by it. The rituals of everyday Soviet life, the parades, the anthems, the red flags, vanished, leaving a void. Even those who had opposed the system found themselves disoriented. The certainties of yesterday, the idea of belonging to something vast and powerful, were replaced by confusion, nostalgia, and resentment. The past, once forbidden, now returned with vengeance. Old monarchists, orthodox priests, and nationalist thinkers re-emerged from the shadows, each offering a different story of what Russia should become. In the vacuum of ideology, myths rushed in. Some looked back to the czars, others to Stalin. The result was a nation without direction, torn between pride and despair. Meanwhile, the West watched with fascination and fear. Western advisors flooded into Moscow, preaching the gospel of free markets and democracy. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank offered loans, but at the cost of painful austerity. Shock therapy, they called it, the sudden transition from socialism to capitalism. The goal was to create a modern economy. The result was chaos. Prices skyrocketed, wages collapsed, and millions fell into poverty. Life expectancy dropped sharply, alcoholism soared. The Soviet Union had promised stability above all else, and now that stability was gone. In the eyes of many Russians, democracy became synonymous with suffering. Yet even amid the darkness, there were flickers of resilience. The Russian people, accustomed to hardship, endured. Artists, filmmakers, and writers found new voices. Independent newspapers challenged power. A small middle class began to emerge, fragile but real. And in the republics beyond Russia, the seeds of transformation took root. The Baltic states embraced Western democracy and began their journey toward the European Union. In Ukraine, a new sense of national identity began to form. In the Caucasus and Central Asia, old traditions revived, blending modern ambition with ancient pride. The Soviet collapse had shattered the old world, but it had also unleashed 1,000 new beginnings. For Russia itself, however, the path forward was anything but clear. In 1999, a weary and disillusioned nation found itself at another turning point. The man who had presided over the chaotic decade, Boris Yeltsin, was old, ailing, and unpopular. His dream of a democratic Russia had faltered under the weight of corruption and crisis. On the last day of the millennium, he appeared on national television, pale and trembling, and announced his resignation. "I am tired," he said simply. "I have done all I could." In his place, he appointed a little-known former intelligence officer named Vladimir Putin as acting president. Putin inherited a nation still haunted by the loss of empire, a nation yearning for order, dignity, and pride. He promised to restore stability, to rebuild the state, to make Russians believe in themselves again. And he delivered, at least at first. Under his rule, the economy stabilized, the oligarchs were tamed, and the chaos of the 1990s faded into memory. But with stability came control, and with control came a new kind of power, one that looked eerily familiar. In his rise, many saw not the end of the Soviet legacy, but its rebirth in a new form. The empire had died, but the desire for greatness, for a Russia that would once again stand tall against the West, remained. By the dawn of the 21st century, the world that had once lived in the shadow of the Soviet Union was transformed. For the first time in modern history, there was no balance of terror, no iron curtain dividing East and West. The Cold War had ended, but peace brought new uncertainties. The United States, now the lone superpower, expanded its influence across Europe and Asia, while Russia, the heart of the former empire, struggled to redefine itself. The collapse of the Soviet Union was supposed to mark the end of history, the victory of democracy and capitalism. But history, as it always does, had other plans. The ghosts of the Soviet past lingered in every corner of the New World Order. In the former republics, the dream of freedom quickly met the hard realities of independence. Some, like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, turned decisively toward the West, joining NATO and the European Union. rebuilding their economies and embracing democracy. Others, like Belarus and the Central Asian states, clung to authoritarian traditions, replacing red flags with new symbols, but maintaining the same old structures of power. Ukraine stood at the crossroads, torn between East and West, between its Soviet legacy and its European aspirations. The dissolution of the USSR had given these nations independence, but it had not erased the deep economic, cultural and political ties that bound them to Moscow. The empire had fallen, but its gravity remained. In Russia, Vladimir Putin understood this better than anyone. He knew that the collapse of the Soviet Union had not only destroyed a state, it had wounded a civilization. In speeches and gestures, he began to reframe the narrative. The 1990s, once hailed by reformers as a time of liberation, were now portrayed as a decade of humiliation. Western advisors, once seen as partners, were cast as opportunists who had exploited Russia's weakness. The fall of the USSR was no longer the inevitable result of a failed system, but the product of betrayal by naive reformers, corrupt elites, and foreign meddlers. For millions of Russians who had lived through poverty and chaos, this narrative rang true. The wounds of collapse had never healed. They had simply hardened into resentment. Under Putin, the state reasserted control. The oligarchs were brought to heel. Those who resisted were exiled, imprisoned, or worse. The press was tamed, elections carefully managed, and dissent silenced. But unlike the gray repression of the Soviet era, this new system wore the mask of modernity. Moscow's skyline glittered with skyscrapers, oil wealth filled the coffers of the state, and the tricolor flag flew proudly over a nation that once again demanded to be taken seriously. For a generation that had known nothing but decline, Putin offered something intoxicating: the illusion of return. He spoke of restoring greatness, of protecting Russian civilization from a hostile world, of reclaiming respect. And in his vision, the fall of the Soviet Union was not a liberation. It was a tragedy. Whoever does not miss the Soviet Union has no heart, he once said. Whoever wants it back has no brain. Yet in his policies, it was clear he wanted something very close: a strong state, an obedient society, and a sphere of influence reminiscent of empire. The world, meanwhile, was still coming to terms with the vacuum the USSR had left behind. The end of bipolar rivalry had unleashed both optimism and chaos. In Eastern Europe, NATO expanded steadily eastward, absorbing former Warsaw Pact countries. To the west, this was a triumph of freedom. To Russia, it was encirclement. In the Middle East, in Africa, in Asia, conflicts once contained by Cold War discipline erupted anew. Without the Soviet Union as a counterweight, the balance of global power tilted, and the unipolar moment of the 1990s began to fracture. The seeds of a new geopolitical struggle were quietly taking root. But beyond geopolitics, the collapse of the Soviet Union left behind something more profound: a question of identity. For 70 years, the USSR had offered a vision of the future. Flawed, oppressive, but undeniably grand. It had inspired revolutionaries, artists, scientists, and dreamers around the world. It had sent men into space, built cities in deserts, and defeated fascism. For those who had grown up under its red banner, its disappearance left an emptiness that capitalism could not fill. Western consumer culture promised comfort, but not meaning. In Russia, the church returned, filling the void with faith. In others, nationalism became the new creed. Yet beneath it all, there lingered a longing, not for the Soviet system itself, but for the sense of purpose it once gave. Outside Russia, the fall of the Soviet Union reshaped entire generations. In the West, victory bred complacency. The Cold War's end was seen as proof that liberal democracy had triumphed forever. Economies globalized, markets opened, and ideology gave way to profit. Yet the very success of this model, and the belief that history itself had reached its final form, planted the seeds of future instability. Without a great rival to define itself against, the West grew divided, inward-looking. The ideological clarity of the 20th century gave way to the moral confusion of the 21st. Meanwhile, the former Soviet states, caught between worlds, became battlegrounds for influence, not through armies, but through pipelines, propaganda, and trade. In this new world, the Soviet collapse was both an end and a beginning. The systems that rose from its ashes were diverse, Democracies, dictatorships, hybrids of both. But all bore the mark of their shared past. The command economy was gone, but the command mentality lingered. The secret police had new names, but the same instincts. Even in nations that broke free, the Soviet legacy haunted institutions and minds alike. Decades after the red flag was lowered, its shadow still stretched across Europe and Asia. For historians, the question remains, could it have ended differently? Was the Soviet Union doomed from birth, or could reform have saved it? Some argue that the empire collapsed under its own contradictions, a system too rigid to survive in a world of change. Others see it as the result of individual choices, Gorbachev's idealism, Yeltsin's ambition, Reagan's pressure, the people's exhaustion. The truth perhaps lies in all of these. The Soviet Union was not simply defeated, it imploded, undone by the weight of its own promises, by the gulf between what it aspired to be and what it became. Its story is not just about politics or economics, but about the fragility of faith in systems, in leaders, in the idea that history can be controlled. And so, as the 21st century unfolds, the fall of the Soviet Union remains one of humanity's defining moments, a reminder that even the mightiest empires are mortal, that ideologies rise and fall, and that behind every revolution lies the same human longing to build a better world. The question is whether we ever truly learn from what we destroy. History rarely ends cleanly. It bleeds forward, reshaping itself, echoing through generations long after the last shots are fired or the last flags are lowered. The Soviet Union was not merely a country. It was an idea, one that sought to rewrite human nature, to build paradise by decree. Its fall was not just the collapse of a state, but the collapse of belief, the realization that even the most powerful ideology can crumble when it forgets the people it claims to serve. And yet, even in its demise, the Soviet story refuses to fade. Its symbols, its fears, its dreams still haunt the present, flickering like ghosts across the map of our modern world. 3 decades after that December night in 1991, the echoes of the Soviet collapse still shape the course of nations. The borders drawn in the aftermath have become the front lines of a new age of conflict, from the frozen trenches of Donbass to the mountain passes of the Caucasus, from the protests in Minsk to the power corridors of Moscow. Every tension, every revolution, every uneasy ceasefire in the former Soviet space carries the weight of history. What fell in 1991 was not just an empire, but an entire worldview, and in its absence, the world has struggled to find balance. The Cold War had given humanity a strange kind of stability. Everyone knew their place. The post-Soviet world, by contrast, became a shifting mosaic of ambition, fear, and memory. For Russia, the loss was existential. The Soviet Union had given it a mission: to lead, to compete, to endure. Without that mission, Russia became a country searching for meaning. The 1990s left scars too deep to fade: hunger, humiliation, chaos. So when a leader promised to restore pride, many were ready to believe. Vladimir Putin's rise was not an accident of politics. It was an answer to trauma. In his language, in his posture, in his vision of a resurgent Russia, he offered redemption. A story in which the pain of the past could be rewritten into strength. But history, once again, proved its irony. In seeking to reverse the humiliation of the Soviet collapse, Putin began to retrace the steps that had led to it. The same obsession with control, the same fear of dissent, the same belief that destiny could be commanded by force. These old instincts returned, cloaked in modern power. The Soviet Union may have died, but the habits of empire endure. Beyond Russia's borders, the legacy of the USSR lives on in quieter ways. In architecture, in memory, in language. In the gray apartment blocks that still line the skylines of Eastern Europe and Central Asia, the Soviet dream lingers like dust on stone. in an instant, not through rebellion or invasion, but through disbelief. And yet, in that collapse, there was also hope. The Soviet Union's end opened doors that had been sealed for generations. Nations reclaimed their voices. Individuals rediscovered their agency. The world became smaller, more connected, more unpredictable. The story of the USSR is not just a tragedy of failure, it is also a testament to resilience. Out of its ruins emerged poets and scientists, reformers and dreamers, all still wrestling with the question the empire could never answer. What does it mean to be free? Even now, as new powers rise and old rivalries return, the specter of the Soviet Union stands as both memory and mirror. When leaders today invoke its strength or lament its fall, they are not only speaking of history, they are revealing their own fears of fragility. Empires, no matter their flag or faith, are bound by the same law. They are made by human hands, and they fall by them too. The Soviet Union's story is not confined to the past, it is a reflection of the eternal struggle between control and chaos, idealism and corruption, the dream of unity and the reality of human nature. Picture, for a moment, that December night once more. The Kremlin illuminated. Against the winter sky, the red flag descending slowly into darkness. In that silence, there was grief, but also grace. The end of the Soviet Union was not only an ending, it was a reckoning, a reminder that history does not stop for ideologies. The empire that had risen from revolution and fire, that had defied the West and reached the stars, was undone not by armies, but by its own contradictions. It collapsed overnight, yes, but the fall had been written for decades in whispers, in shortages, in small acts of disbelief. When the people stopped believing, the empire stopped existing. And yet, perhaps that is how history always ends. Not with thunder, but with silence. A silence filled with the echoes of what once was, and what might have been. The Soviet Union's legacy